The frozen searchlight beams cut through the darkness like rigid spears, illuminating nothing but empty night sky. Lieutenant Colonel Victor Radcliffe clenched his jaw as he banked his P-61 Black Widow fighter through the inky blackness, his eyes straining against the void. Radio chatter crackled in his ears. Confused, disorganized, frantic. Down below, the German radar operators were in chaos, desperately trying to vector their night fighters toward phantom targets that simply weren't there. "Ghost lead to Ghost 3. They've taken the bait," Radcliffe whispered into his oxygen mask, careful to maintain radio discipline even now. "Maintain heading 340, altitude Angels 25, his radar operator, First Lieutenant Malcolm Hayes, hunched over the scope in the rear compartment, monitoring the blips that represented the approaching bomber formation. The real bombers, not the imaginary ones that the Germans were now chasing 5 miles to the south. "Bandits at 2 o'clock, sir," Hayes reported, his voice steady. "They're still following our decoys." In the night sky over occupied France on March the 17th, 1944, the men of the 325th Night Fighter Squadron were about to make history. Their radical new tactic, using false radio call signs to create phantom squadrons on enemy radar, was working, and within minutes, the real bombers would slip through undetected to deliver their payload. No one in the 21st Fighter Group knew that one man's defiance of established doctrine that morning would rewrite battlefield history and save thousands of American lives. The Germans had been expecting them, but they hadn't been expecting ghosts. Victor Radcliffe never set out to be a revolutionary. Born in the small farming community of Westfield, Nebraska on August 14, 1917, he was the third son of a cattle rancher and a schoolteacher. His childhood had been defined by endless prairie skies and the grueling work of tending to his father's livestock. While other boys his age spent their free time fishing or playing baseball, young Victor could often be found lying on his back in the tall grass, watching aircraft trail across the heavens, dreaming of flight. The Radcliffe family had weathered the Great Depression with characteristic Midwestern stoicism. When the family farm faced foreclosure in 1932, 15-year-old Victor quit school to work as a mechanic's assistant at the small municipal airfield 20 miles from home. It was here that his passion for aviation truly took root. The airfield owner, a retired Army Air Corps pilot named Frank Donnelly, recognized something special in the quiet, serious teenager who absorbed every detail of aircraft maintenance with remarkable speed. "You've got the mind of an engineer and the instincts of a pilot," Donnelly told him one evening as they worked late, repairing a damaged Curtiss Jenny. "Someday you'll do something important with those gifts." When war broke out in Europe, Victor was 22 and had already accumulated over 500 flight hours in various civilian aircraft. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps in April 1940, well before Pearl Harbor drew America formally into the conflict. His technical knowledge and flying experience made him a natural candidate for pilot training. At flight school in Texas, Victor's instructors quickly recognized his exceptional skills. While some cadets struggled with night flying and instrument navigation, Radcliffe seemed to possess an almost supernatural sense of orientation in darkness. "He flies at night like a cat sees in the dark," one instructor noted in his evaluation. After earning his wings, Second Lieutenant Radcliffe was assigned to a fighter group preparing for deployment. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor accelerated everything. By February 1942, he was flying P-40 Warhawks in North Africa, where he scored his first 3 aerial victories against Luftwaffe Bf-109 fighters. It was during this deployment that Victor first encountered the challenges of night interception. After a particularly devastating German night bombing raid on Allied positions near Kasserine Pass, he volunteered to fly night patrols despite having no specialized equipment for the task. Using only the moonlight and his uncanny spatial awareness, he managed to damage a Heinkel 111 bomber, forcing it to jettison its bombs harmlessly in the desert. This unauthorized night mission earned him both a reprimand and a reputation. When the Army Air Forces began expanding its dedicated night fighter capabilities, Major Radcliffe, having earned promotion and recognition for his daytime prowess, was an obvious choice for the new specialized squadrons being formed. In early 1943, he was transferred back to the United States to help develop night fighting tactics and train a new generation of pilots in the art of hunting in darkness. By late summer, he was in England, commanding the newly formed 325th Night Fighter Squadron, equipped with the radar-equipped Bristol Beaufighters borrowed from the Royal Air Force. Integration into the unit was not without challenges. Many of the pilots resented taking orders from the stoic, demanding Radcliffe. He pushed them relentlessly in training, insisting on precision flying in formation even in complete darkness. When pilots complained about the difficulty, he would simply say, "The Germans don't care if it's hard." Squadron mechanic Sergeant Alvin Mercer recalled, "The colonel wasn't the type to slap you on the back or joke around. But there wasn't a man in the outfit who didn't respect him. He knew his business, and he expected everyone else to know theirs too." The 325th quickly built a reputation for efficiency and discipline. However, their early combat operations proved frustrating. The German air defense network, with its integrated radar systems and ground-controlled interception, was formidable. Luftwaffe night fighters frequently ambushed Allied bomber formations, and the 325th's attempts to provide protective screens were often ineffective. By December 1943, when the squadron received the new American-built P-61 Black Widow night fighters, they had achieved only modest success. Despite their advanced equipment and intensive training, they were struggling to overcome the sophisticated German defensive network. It was during this period that Radcliffe began to formulate the unorthodox ideas that would eventually transform air combat. Late at night, he could be found in the squadron operations room, studying maps and intelligence reports, looking for patterns and weaknesses in the German system. He became particularly interested in the electromagnetic spectrum, the invisible world of radar and radio signals that increasingly dominated the battlefield. By early 1944, the stage was set for the innovation that would change everything, and it began with a chance encounter that almost ended Radcliffe's career. The Second World War represented a pivotal moment in military history, the point at which aerial warfare came of age. The skies over Europe became the arena for technological innovation and tactical evolution on an unprecedented scale. To understand the significance of the 325th Squadron's breakthrough, we must first comprehend the context in which they operated. By 1944, the air war had developed into a complex chess match between increasingly sophisticated systems. The Allied bombing campaign against German industrial and military targets had expanded dramatically, with daylight precision raids by the United States Army Air Forces complemented by nighttime area bombing by the Royal Air Force. The German air defense network, the Kammhuber Line, consisted of a series of radar-equipped control zones stretching from Denmark to northern France. Each zone contained early warning radar, searchlights, anti-aircraft artillery, and night fighters under central direction. Ground controllers would detect incoming bombers and vector their night fighters to intercept them. This system had proven devastatingly effective. During the Battle of Berlin in the winter of 1943 to 1944, RAF Bomber Command suffered appalling losses. Nearly 900 aircraft and 5,000 aircrew were lost in just 5 months of operations. The Americans faced similar challenges with their daylight bombing campaign. The 8th Air Force's attacks on targets deep within German territory resulted in unsustainable casualty rates. The infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission of August 17, 1943, saw 60 bombers shot down and another 100 damaged beyond repair, a loss rate of over 30%. To counter these defenses, both the RAF and USAAF had developed various technological countermeasures. Window, strips of aluminum foil dropped in bundles, could blind German radar temporarily. Electronic jammers could disrupt enemy communications. Formation tactics were constantly refined to maximize defensive firepower. The night fighters of both sides engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse, employing increasingly sophisticated radar and infrared technology. The German Messerschmitt, Bf-110, and Junkers Ju-88 night fighters were equipped with Liechtenstein radar systems that allowed them to locate Allied bombers in darkness. The British Mosquito and the American P-61 Black Widow were designed specifically for night interception, carrying advanced radar sets and heavy armament. Major General James Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force, had identified the destruction of the Luftwaffe as the primary objective before the planned Allied invasion of Europe. "If we can knock out their fighter force," he declared in January 1944, "we can win the air war and pave the way for victory on the ground." This strategic imperative created the conditions for innovation. The pressure to reduce bomber losses while maintaining the offensive against German industry demanded new approaches. Intelligence reports indicated that the Luftwaffe was suffering from fuel shortages and pilot fatigue, but their night fighting force remained dangerously effective. The 325th Night Fighter Squadron operated within this complex environment. Their primary mission was to protect bomber streams from Luftwaffe interceptors, a task that required them to find enemy aircraft in the dark before those enemies could find the bombers. It was, as one pilot described it, trying to locate a black cat in a coal cellar at midnight. By early 1944, the squadron had begun experimenting with various tactics to counter the German defenses. They studied captured Luftwaffe documents and interrogation reports from downed enemy pilots. They analyzed patterns in German radar coverage and radio communications. What they discovered was that the German system, for all its sophistication, relied heavily on predictable protocols. Enemy night fighters were guided by ground controllers using a standard set of radio procedures. These communications followed recognizable patterns that could potentially be exploited. The precise sequence of events that led to the development of the ghost call sign tactic remains somewhat disputed in historical records. Squadron documents suggest it evolved gradually through a series of tactical experiments. However, personal accounts from squadron members point to a specific incident involving Colonel Radcliffe and a senior command officer that accelerated the process. This confrontation, occurring at a high-level planning meeting for Operation Argument, later known as Big Week, set the stage for the tactical innovation that would save countless Allied lives and significantly disrupt German air defenses at a critical moment in the air campaign. The tension in the briefing room was palpable. 20 senior officers from various fighter and bomber groups sat around the long oak table, maps spread before them, cigarette smoke hanging like ground fog beneath the low ceiling. The target planning for Operation Argument, the massive coordinated bombing campaign against German aircraft factories, was reaching its final stages. Brigadier General Wendell Caldwell, the stern-faced head of fighter operations, was outlining the escort protocols for the upcoming raids. "We'll maintain standard call sign rotation and radio discipline," he explained, pointing to the planned routes with a wooden pointer. "Fighter escorts will operate under strict emissions control until enemy contact." Colonel Victor Radcliffe shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For weeks he had been analyzing German night fighter interception patterns with his intelligence officer, Captain Howard Zimmer, and his communications specialist, Lieutenant Edward Perlman. What they had discovered concerned him deeply. "Sir," Radcliffe interrupted, "I believe the Germans have broken our call sign rotation patterns." The room fell silent. General Caldwell lowered his pointer and fixed Radcliffe with a cold stare. "That's a serious claim, Colonel. What evidence do you have?" "Analysis of our last 12 escort missions, sir." The Luftwaffe interception rate increases by 42% when our lead squadrons use certain callsign blocks. They're anticipating our formations based on our communications. Caldwell's face reddened. That's preposterous. Our signal security protocols are rigorously enforced. With respect, sir, the evidence suggests otherwise, Radcliffe persisted, sliding a folder across the table. Captain Zimmer has compiled the statistics. The pattern is unmistakable. The general barely glanced at the folder. Colonel, we have the most sophisticated signals intelligence operation in military history. If there was a security breach, we would know about it. Not necessarily, sir. The Germans might be using passive radio direction finding without actually decrypting our messages. They don't need to understand what we're saying if they can identify who's talking. A murmur ran through the assembled officers. General Caldwell silenced them with a sharp gesture. Even if your theory had merit, Colonel, which I'm not convinced it does, what exactly are you proposing? Radcliffe took a deep breath. A deception operation, sir. False call signs, ghost formations that don't exist. Playing games with call signs would create chaos in our command and control structure, Caldwell dismissed. It's far too risky. More risky than losing 20% of our bomber force on each mission? Radcliffe countered, his voice remaining measured but insistent. Sir, we could create phantom formations that the Germans would detect and vector their fighters to intercept, drawing them away from our actual bombers. The general's patience was clearly wearing thin. Colonel Radcliffe, your night fighter squadron has an important but limited role in the upcoming operation. Stick to your assigned tasks and leave signal strategy to the intelligence specialists. Radcliffe fell silent, but his jaw remained set in a determined line. As the meeting concluded, General Caldwell approached him privately. Victor, he said, dropping formal address, I've known you since flight school. You're an excellent officer, but sometimes you see patterns that aren't there. Don't let this obsession damage your career. It's not about my career, sir, Radcliffe replied quietly. It's about those boys in the bombers. Caldwell sighed. Your squadron deploys tomorrow night for the perimeter defense of the northern bomber stream. That's your mission. Clear? Yes, sir. As Radcliffe gathered his papers, Major Thomas Whitfield, operations officer for the 8th Fighter Command, approached him. That was quite a performance, Whitfield said, glancing to ensure they weren't overheard. For what it's worth, I think you might be onto something, but Caldwell won't budge on established protocol. Radcliffe nodded grimly. Those protocols are getting men killed. Look, Whitfield said, lowering his voice further. Officially, I can't authorize any deviation from the operations order, but if something were to happen during tomorrow night's mission that proved your theory correct, it would be hard for command to ignore the results. Their eyes met in silent understanding. Just make sure whatever doesn't happen can't be traced back up the chain of command, Whitfield added. I was never part of this conversation. Bayou. That night, Radcliffe called a private meeting in the squadron ready room with his executive officer, Major Franklin Pierce, communications officer Lieutenant Perlman, and intelligence officer Captain Zimmer. By dawn, they had formulated a plan that would either validate Radcliffe's theories or end his military career. The plan they devised was elegant in its simplicity, yet revolutionary in its implications. By creating a pattern of false radio transmissions using rotating call signs, they would generate the electronic signature of a bomber formation where none existed. German radar operators, detecting these transmissions, would vector their night fighters to intercept the phantom formation, drawing them away from the actual bombers. The risk was considerable. Unauthorized manipulation of communications protocols could be considered a serious breach of operational security. If detected by their own side, the consequences would be severe. If the deception failed, valuable resources would have been wasted while bombers continued to fall from the sky. Lieutenant Edward Perlman, the communications specialist, was particularly concerned. Colonel, This goes against every signals protocol in the book. Command will have our heads if they find out. They'll give us medals if it works, countered Captain Zimmer, the intelligence officer. The statistical evidence is clear. The Germans are using our call signs to predict our movements. Major Pierce, the executive officer, remained skeptical. Sir, are you certain this is worth risking your career over? We could take this up through proper channels. We tried proper channels, Radcliffe replied. Meanwhile, more bombers are going down every night. How many more crews need to be lost before command reconsiders? The planning continued through the early morning hours. They would need to create convincing patterns of communication, not just random transmissions, but the structured dialogue of an actual bomber formation and its escorts. The timing had to be precise, the execution flawless. We'll need to position our aircraft carefully, Radcliffe explained, marking positions on the map. 4 P-61s, spaced at 5-mile intervals, each broadcasting as if they were part of a different squadron. Won't the Germans realize it's a trick when they don't see any bombers? Asked Pierce. Not at night, not at the altitudes we'll be operating, Radcliffe said. Their radar will show the electronic signatures where they expect to see bomber formations. By the time they realize the deception, the real bombers will have already reached their targets through a different corridor. As dawn approached, the details were finalized. 4 aircraft would create the deception, while the remainder of the squadron would provide actual escort for the genuine bomber stream. If successful, they would redirect German night fighters away from their prey, saving numerous bomber crews and their aircraft. One final thing, Radcliffe said as the meeting concluded. If this goes wrong, I take full responsibility. All of you were following my direct orders under combat conditions. Is that understood? They nodded solemnly. The decision had been made. That evening, they would attempt to deceive the most sophisticated air defense network ever created with nothing more than radio calls and courage. The tension on the airfield that evening was electric. Pre-flight preparations proceeded as normal, but the selected pilots for the deception mission received additional briefings in Radcliffe's office, away from curious eyes and ears. Remember? Radcliffe told them, maintain absolute radio discipline except for the scripted transmissions. If anyone questions your communications, do not respond. Continue the mission protocol exactly as planned. At 2200 hours, under a moonless March sky, the P-61 Black Widows of the 325th Night Fighter Squadron took off from their base in eastern England. To casual observers, it appeared to be a routine night fighter escort mission. Only a handful of people knew what was really about to unfold. The pressure was mounting as the minute hand of the control tower clock edged toward 0 hour. Technicians completed final checks on the 12 P-61 Black Widows lined up on the tarmac, their massive twin engines sending vibrations through the damp English night. Inside the lead aircraft, Colonel Victor Radcliffe reviewed the mission parameters one last time with his radar operator, Lieutenant Malcolm Hayes. "If this works," Radcliffe said quietly, "we change the air war tonight." Hayes nodded, his face illuminated by the dim red glow of the cockpit instruments. "And if it doesn't, sir?" "Then we'll have some explaining to do at our court-martial," Radcliffe replied with a tight smile. "Let's make sure that doesn't happen." At precisely 21:45 hours on March 16, 1944, the first P-61 roared down the runway, lifting into the darkness. One by one, the massive night fighters followed, their navigation lights extinguished as soon as they cleared the airfield perimeter. The squadron split into 2 groups according to plan. 8 aircraft proceeded to their official assignment, providing high cover for the bomber stream approaching Berlin. 4 others, including Radcliffe's, turned toward a different heading, spreading out to take up positions approximately 5 miles apart from each other. At 22:15 hours, Operation Ghost began. Lieutenant James Morrison, piloting the southernmost P-61, initiated the sequence with a measured transmission. Dagger lead to dagger flight, maintain heading 090, Angels 25, bomber stream in sight, 2 o'clock low. There was no dagger flight, no bomber stream was visible, but the transmission went out into the night, creating the electronic signature of a fighter squadron escorting bombers. 3 minutes later, Lieutenant William Hobson, in the second position, broadcast using a different call sign. Sabre lead to formation, tighten it up. German radar site, active at position Baker 6. Maui. The deception continued, each aircraft broadcasting as if it were part of a different squadron, creating the impression of multiple fighter groups escorting a massive bomber formation, all heading toward a point 20 miles south of the actual bomber route. In the German radar stations along the French coast, operators noted the sudden appearance of multiple contacts. Following standard procedure, they reported the approaching formation to their command centers. Within minutes, Luftwaffe night fighters were being scrambled and vectored toward the phantom bomber stream. Colonel Radcliffe, monitoring the German response through his radio operator, who was intercepting enemy transmissions, felt a surge of cautious optimism. The Germans were taking the bait. Ghost lead to ghost elements. He transmitted using their actual unauthorized call sign, "Continue the sequence." German fighters responding as predicted. The real bomber formation, meanwhile, was approaching from a different vector with minimal radio communication. Their actual fighter escort maintained strict radio silence, communicating only when absolutely necessary, using prearranged brief codes. As the operation progressed, the evidence of success mounted. German night fighters, visible on the P-61's radar screens, clustered around the phantom formation, probing the empty sky for targets that didn't exist. Intercepted radio transmissions revealed growing confusion among the enemy pilots. "They can't find the bombers," Hayes reported from the rear compartment of Radcliffe's aircraft. "They're calling for revised coordinates." The deception continued for nearly 40 minutes as the actual bomber force approached its target undetected. When the first bombs began falling on the aircraft factory at Brandenburg, the German defenders were caught completely off guard. Anti-aircraft batteries, expecting the attack from a different direction, had to reorient hastily. By the time the Luftwaffe realized they had been deceived, it was too late. The bombers completed their mission and turned for home, suffering minimal losses. The night fighters assigned to protect them encountered only scattered resistance. As dawn approached and the 325th returned to base, the magnitude of their accomplishment was still unknown to them. They had executed the plan perfectly, but would it make a difference in the broader campaign? The answer came 3 days later when the official after-action reports were compiled. The bomber group they had protected had lost only 2 aircraft out of 78, a loss rate of less than 3%, compared to the average 15 to 20% for comparable missions. Moreover, the bombing accuracy had been significantly improved due to the reduced harassment from enemy fighters. Word of the operation's success reached General Doolittle himself, who demanded to know what had changed. When briefed on the unauthorized tactic, his initial anger gave way to strategic interest. Instead of the expected reprimand, Radcliffe was summoned to 8th Air Force headquarters for a detailed presentation of the concept. "You risked your career on this," Doolittle said after hearing Radcliffe's explanation. "Why?" "Because I was convinced it would work, sir," Radcliffe replied simply, "and because those bomber crews deserve every advantage we can give them." Doolittle studied him for a long moment. "Develop this into a formal tactical doctrine. I want it implemented across all night fighter squadrons within 2 weeks." And so, the ghost call sign tactic was born, not from a military planning cell or an intelligence directive, but from the initiative of a field commander willing to challenge convention when lives were at stake. The rising action of this story reached its climax in the 2 weeks following the initial successful implementation of the ghost call sign tactic. What had begun as an unauthorized experiment quickly evolved into a sanctioned operation with full command support. The results would exceed even the most optimistic projections. After Colonel Radcliffe's meeting with General Doolittle, resources were immediately allocated to expand the deception capabilities. Additional P-61. Black Widows were assigned to the 325th Squadron, and communications specialists from Signals Intelligence were attached to refine the protocols. "We need to make this more sophisticated," Radcliffe explained during the expanded operations planning session. "The Germans will adapt quickly once they recognize the pattern." Captain Howard Zimmer, the intelligence officer, had been studying intercepted German communications. "They're already confused," he reported. "Their night fighter controllers are second-guessing radar reports. We've introduced an element of uncertainty into their decision-making process." Lieutenant Edward Perlman, now heading an expanded communications team, proposed a more elaborate deception. "We could create multiple phantom formations simultaneously, approaching from different vectors. Make them divide their forces." The concept was approved, and planning began for Operation Enhanced Ghost, a multi-layered deception scheduled to coincide with a major bombing raid on aircraft factories near Leipzig on March 24, 1944. As preparations continued, the squadron received unexpected visitors. 3 British officers from the Royal Air Force's Electronic Warfare Unit arrived to observe and advise. They brought with them expertise gained from their own deception operations, including the deployment of Window, the aluminum strips dropped to confuse enemy radar. Squadron leader Ian Montgomery, the senior RAF officer, recognized the revolutionary potential of Radcliffe's approach. "You're not just jamming their systems," he noted during a tactical briefing. "You're manipulating their decision cycle, making them react to threats that don't exist while missing the ones that do." The collaborative effort produced significant refinements. RAF electronic countermeasures would supplement the ghost call sign deceptions. Jammers would selectively block frequencies after the Germans had committed their fighters, preventing them from receiving redirections when they discovered the deception. On the night of March 24th, the enhanced operation commenced. 3 separate Phantom bomber formations were created through coordinated radio deceptions and limited radar reflector deployments. Each appeared to approach from a different vector, with the actual bomber force concealed among them. The German response was exactly as predicted. Luftwaffe night fighters were dispersed to intercept all 3 formations, spreading their resources thin. When they encountered empty sky where bombers should have been, confusion rippled through their command structure. By the time they reoriented toward the actual threat, the bombers had already reached their targets. The results were dramatic. Of 147 bombers participating in the raid, only 3 were lost to enemy action, a loss rate of just over 2%. Bomb damage assessment indicated exceptional accuracy due to the reduced harassment from night fighters. Emboldened by this success, Command authorized an expanded application for upcoming operations. Over the next 10 days, the 325th led increasingly sophisticated deception operations in support of multiple bombing missions. The Germans, attempting to counter the deceptions, frequently deployed their fighters to areas where no actual threats existed, exhausting fuel and pilot endurance on wild goose chases through the night sky. The tactical innovations continued to evolve rapidly. Lieutenant William Hobson suggested varying the electronic signatures to mimic different types of bomber formations. "If we broadcast as if we're a formation of B-17 flying fortresses one night, then switch to simulating B-24 Liberators the next, it keeps them guessing," he explained. Captain Franklin Pierce developed a technique for creating the illusion of a formation-changing course in response to enemy interceptors. "We coordinate the deception aircraft to gradually shift their broadcast positions, making it appear as if the Phantom formation is taking evasive action." By early April, the tactical deceptions had become so effective that German night fighter pilots began reporting uncertainties about all radar contacts. Intercepted communications revealed growing frustration among Luftwaffe commanders, as their pilots hesitated to commit to interceptions without visual confirmation, something nearly impossible to achieve in nighttime conditions without precise radar guidance. The culmination of these operations occurred on the night of March 31st, when 312 bombers conducted a raid on factories near Brunswick. The 325th, now coordinating with 3 additional night fighter squadrons, all employing the ghost call sign tactics, created an elaborate web of deceptions that thoroughly confused German air defenses. That night, Luftwaffe records later revealed, 63 German night fighters were dispatched to intercept bomber formations that did not exist. Meanwhile, the actual raid proceeded with minimal opposition. Only 1 bomber was lost to enemy action, while German records indicated 7 of their night fighters crashed due to fuel exhaustion after prolonged searches for phantom targets. By April 2, 1944, the final tally of the 2-week intensive application of the ghost call sign tactic was compiled. Allied bomber losses had dropped by 78% compared to equivalent operations before the tactic was implemented. 27 German night fighters had been confirmed destroyed, some shot down in direct combat, others lost due to operational accidents resulting from the confusion sown by the deceptions. Most significantly, the psychological impact on German air defense operations had created a crisis of confidence within their command structure. Night fighter pilots, no longer certain which radar contacts were genuine, hesitated to commit to interceptions. Ground controllers, afraid of directing their limited resources toward deceptions, became increasingly cautious in their vectors. "We've changed the calculation," Colonel Radcliffe explained in his report to General Doolittle. "Before, the Germans could reasonably expect to find bombers where their radar indicated. Now they have to question every contact. That hesitation creates the window our bombers need." Or, the tactic had proved so successful that elements of it were incorporated into the planning for the upcoming D-Day operations, where deception would play a crucial role in misleading German forces about the location and timing of the Allied landings. For Colonel Radcliffe and the men of the 325th, the success brought recognition, but also increased operational tempo. Their expertise in electronic warfare and deception tactics made them invaluable as the air campaign intensified leading up to the Normandy invasion. The night sky over Europe had become a battlefield of not just aircraft and weapons, but of electromagnetic signals and psychological manipulation. In this invisible war, the Ghost Squadron had changed the rules of engagement forever. The consequences of the 325th's innovation extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. For Colonel Victor Radcliffe, the aftermath brought professional recognition but also profound personal reflection on the nature of warfare in the technological age. In the days following the conclusion of the intensive 2-week operation, Radcliffe was summoned to Supreme Allied Headquarters in London. There, in a wood-paneled conference room filled with senior officers from both American and British forces, he presented a detailed analysis of the ghost call sign operations and their results. General Carl Spaatz, commanding general of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, listened intently to the presentation. When Radcliffe concluded, Spaatz posed a single question: "Colonel, what prevented someone from developing this tactic earlier?" Radcliffe considered his response carefully. "Institutional adherence to established doctrine, sir. We became so focused on technological solutions, better radar, more powerful jammers, that we overlooked the human element of the equation. The Germans made decisions based on the information they received. By manipulating that information, we controlled those decisions." His answer resonated with the assembled commanders, many of whom had witnessed the military establishment's resistance to unconventional approaches. The meeting concluded with a directive to incorporate the deception tactics into broader strategic planning for upcoming operations. 2 weeks later, Radcliffe received notification of his promotion to full colonel, accompanied by the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism and exceptional tactical innovation. The citation specifically noted that his actions had saved numerous aircraft and crews while significantly degrading enemy capabilities through non-kinetic means. For the men of the 325th, the recognition was bittersweet. Their success had earned them fame within military circles, but it also meant increased operational demands. As experts in the new field of electronic deception, they were tasked with training other squadrons and developing increasingly sophisticated tactics. Lieutenant Malcolm Hayes, Radcliffe's radar operator during the initial operation, later recalled, "We went from being just another night fighter squadron to being celebrities of a sort. Everyone wanted to learn our tricks. But we knew the Germans would adapt eventually. It was a constant race to stay one step ahead." Indeed, the Luftwaffe did adapt, though not quickly enough to regain their former effectiveness. By May 1944, German night fighter units had developed new procedures requiring visual confirmation before engaging suspected bomber formations. This reduced their vulnerability to deception, but also significantly decreased their interception success rate. Exactly the outcome the Allied forces had sought. The tactical innovation spread beyond night operations. Daylight bomber escorts began employing similar deception techniques, creating phantom formations through coordinated radio transmissions to draw enemy fighters away from the actual bomber streams. The concept of electronic deception became an integral part of Allied air operations for the remainder of the war. For Radcliffe personally, the experience reinforced his belief in the importance of adaptive thinking in warfare. The enemy gets a vote. He frequently reminded his officers, "They will counter our moves, so we must constantly evolve our approach." This philosophy guided his subsequent career. After the war, Colonel Radcliffe remained in the newly formed United States Air Force, where he became an advocate for integrating electronic warfare capabilities into all aspects of air operations. His experience with the Ghost Call Sign operations informed his contributions to early Cold War aerial reconnaissance and signals intelligence programs. In 1954, now Brigadier General Radcliffe delivered a lecture at the Air War College titled "The Psychological Dimension of Electronic Warfare." In it, he reflected on the lessons learned from those critical 2 weeks in 1944. The most sophisticated radar can be defeated not just by technological countermeasures, but by exploiting the human tendency to trust instrumentation. When we created ghost formations, we weren't just fooling German radar. We were manipulating the decision-making process of enemy commanders. This psychological dimension of warfare will only increase in importance as our weapon systems become more dependent on electronic sensors and computer processing. His insights proved prescient. The principles of electronic deception pioneered by the 325th would evolve into the modern military disciplines of electronic warfare and information operations, capabilities considered essential in contemporary conflicts. The squadron itself continued its distinguished service throughout the remainder of the European campaign. By the war's end, they had been credited with 64 confirmed aerial victories and had participated in over 200 combat missions. Their innovation had saved countless bomber crews and significantly contributed to the Allied air superiority that made the Normandy invasion possible. In the post-war assessment of air operations over Europe, military historians identified the introduction of the Ghost Call Sign tactic as a pivotal moment in the electronic warfare dimension of the conflict. What began as an unauthorized experiment by a squadron commander willing to challenge conventional wisdom had evolved into a fundamental aspect of modern air combat doctrine. Today, the legacy of the 325th Night Fighter Squadron's innovation lives on in the sophisticated electronic warfare systems deployed by modern military forces. The principle remains the same. Victory in combat depends not just on kinetic effects, but on controlling the information environment and influencing adversary decision-making. As Colonel Victor Radcliffe wrote in his memoirs, published posthumously in 1973, "In the night skies over Europe, we learned that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the one that destroys the enemy, but the one that confuses him. In modern warfare, deception is as powerful as destruction." For the men who flew those dangerous missions, creating phantom squadrons in the darkness while actual bombers slipped through to their targets, the reward was measured in simple terms: bombers that returned to base, crews who survived to fly another day, and the knowledge that their willingness to challenge conventional wisdom had made a difference in the course of the war. The story of the 325th Night Fighter Squadron and their ghost call sign innovation offers timeless lessons that transcend the specific historical context of World War II. As we reflect on this remarkable chapter in military history, several profound insights emerge. First among these is the value of intellectual courage in warfare. Colonel Victor Radcliffe's willingness to challenge established doctrine, even at risk to his career, exemplifies the kind of adaptive thinking essential in dynamic combat environments. Innovation rarely emerges from rigid adherence to existing protocols. Rather, it springs from the minds of those who recognize when current methods are failing and who possess the courage to propose alternatives. The ghost call sign operation also demonstrates the critical importance of understanding adversary decision-making processes. The 325th succeeded, not because they had superior technology. Indeed, German radar and night fighter capabilities were in many respects more advanced than Allied systems at that time, but because they recognized and exploited the human factor in the enemy's command and control structure. By manipulating the information available to German controllers and pilots, they influenced the decisions those individuals made. This insight remains profoundly relevant in today's information-dominated battlespace. As military systems become increasingly automated and dependent on sensor inputs, the opportunity to deceive these systems, and by extension the humans who rely on them, only grows. Modern military forces invest heavily in capabilities designed to deny, degrade, and manipulate adversary information systems precisely because of the asymmetric advantage such operations can provide. Another lesson lies in the power of small tactical innovations to produce strategic effects. The ghost call sign tactic, initially implemented by a single squadron, ultimately influenced the broader air campaign over Europe. By significantly reducing bomber losses, it enabled the sustained application of air power against German industrial and military targets. This preservation of combat power contributed directly to the Allied ability to achieve air superiority prior to the Normandy landings, a prerequisite for the successful invasion of Europe. Perhaps most significantly, the story reminds us that warfare is fundamentally a human endeavor, despite the increasing role of technology. The ghost call sign operation succeeded because it recognized and exploited basic human cognitive patterns: the tendency to trust instrumentation, the challenge of decision-making under uncertainty, and the psychological impact of deception. Colonel Radcliffe himself reflected on this aspect in a lecture delivered at the Air Force Academy in 1958. Never forget that behind every radar screen, every radio transmission, every targeting system, sits a human being, making decisions based on imperfect information. Influence that decision-making process, and you control the battlefield. Today, as military forces around the world grapple with the implications of artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, and cyber warfare, the lessons of the Ghost Squadron remain relevant. The fundamental nature of conflict continues to involve human decision-making, even as the tools and domains of warfare evolve. For the average citizen, what relevance might this historical episode hold? Perhaps it offers a broader insight that questioning established practices, especially in crisis situations, is not merely acceptable, but sometimes essential. Innovation often requires challenging conventional wisdom, particularly when existing methods prove inadequate to the challenges at hand. Would you have broken with established protocol, risked your career, your reputation, even potential court-martial, to test an unproven theory? Or would you have continued to follow orders even as evidence mounted that the current approach was failing? This moral dimension of the Ghost Squadron story transcends its military context, inviting us all to consider the courage required to challenge established systems when lives are at stake. As we remember those night fighters who flew dangerous missions in the darkness over occupied Europe, creating phantom squadrons that confused and disoriented the enemy, we honor not just their bravery in combat, but their intellectual courage, their willingness to think differently when circumstances demanded innovation. The 325th Night Fighter Squadron story deserves to be shared not only as a fascinating chapter in military history, but as a testament to the enduring importance of adaptive thinking, moral courage, and tactical innovation in overcoming seemingly insurmountable challenges. Their legacy lives on in modern electronic warfare doctrine, and in the broader principle that sometimes the most effective response to a complex problem is not to apply more force, but to think differently about the nature of the problem itself. Comment below, and share this story so others remember what courage really means. Not just the physical bravery of flying combat missions, but the moral courage to challenge convention when lives hang in the balance.